Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners! This week we're taking a deeper look at Central Asia's post-colonial legacy and how Russia's centuries-long influence has shaped ways of thinking, institutions and everyday life in the region. Russian colonization of Central Asia began in the early 1800s and expanded steadily throughout the 19th century. Following the Russian Revolution, most of Central Asia was incorporated into the Soviet Union. This period brought rapid industrialization and infrastructure development. But it also suppressed local cultures in a manner typical of colonial regimes. The Russian language came to be seen as a marker of civilization and positioned as superior to local languages, while people were expected to conform to the values of a secular, rational Soviet state. To meet the demands of the increasingly authoritarian new superstate, millions of people, representatives of ethnic groups seen as suspicious and potentially rebellious, were deported to Central Asia. Gulags, that is, forced labor camps, were established across the Soviet periphery. Finally, man-made famines driven by brutal collectivization policies claimed thousands of lives in both Central Asia and Ukraine. The ethnic and demographic makeup of the region was permanently altered. And yet, some scholars, both in Russia and the West, continue to argue that the Soviet Union was not an empire, but rather a benevolent force striving to build a just, multicultural society. Even in modern-day Central Asian states, which gained independence after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, many still express nostalgia for the Soviet past, often overlooking its darker chapters. Russian remains widely spoken, and for many, it is still the only language they know. Today we will look at all those paradoxes, explore Soviet nostalgia and imperial melancholia, focusing on a rarely heard perspective, that of Turkmenistan. Joining us is Selvi Durdieva, a decolonial scholar originally from Turkmenistan and a teaching fellow at the College of Law, Anthropology and Politics at SOAS, University of London. Her research interests include decoloniality, transitional justice, and socio-legal approaches. Her book, titled The Role of Civil Society in Transitional Justice, The Case of Russia, was published by Routledge in 2024. She is also my Substack colleague and runs a newsletter called Notes from Pluriverse. Welcome to Turan Talks. Hi, Selvi.
Hi, Agnieszka. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you so much for accepting my invitation. Before we move into this the discussion that we have today, tell me a little bit about your background. Where are you from and what kind of community you grew up in?
Yes, of course. I am from Turkmenistan originally. I am from a capital city of Turkmenistan, Ashgabat. I lived in Ashgabat all my childhood. I lived there until I was 15. I lived quite centrally, and I went to a school in Ashgabat as well. And I am one of those generations of the first president of Turkmenistan, who was Sapar Murat Niyazov. So I had 9 years of school because of that, and I went to the school which was taught in Russian. Yeah, I have two brothers, and I am from a mixed background, which is quite common for Central Asia. My mother is Kazakh, my father is Turkmen, but I also have Tatar great-grandmother and Uzbek great-grandmother. And my parents met in Moscow when they were studying, so quite an international background, but I am I only lived in one city in Turkmenistan, the capital.
So what was the language that you grew up speaking? Like, do you know any other language apart from Russian?
Yes. Part of the policy back then, back in the day, was three language policy, which meant Turkmen, Russian, and English. All schools taught these languages, and in addition, in our school, we could choose either French or German to study. So I chose French. I grew up speaking mostly Russian in my family because I have an international family, and it was the language of communication. But language is not really an issue in Turkmenistan because majority of people spoke Turkmen, still speak Turkmen by default. If you go to a bazaar or if you on the street, people speak Turkmen. And what's also quite particular about Turkmenistan that Turkmenistan adopted Latin alphabet straight away. So it wasn't Cyrillic, and I was learning Turkmen in Latin. I was reading Turkmen in Latin, and I was writing in Latin as well.
Recently, Russia announced that it will create a special unit to promote the Russian language, the Russian culture in the post-Soviet space, including Central Asia. Do you think it's because they fear that the Russian influence is fading in Central Asia? And what do you make of it?
Yeah, it's a great question. Language is it's a cultural device, it's a power device, and I guess there are some anxieties in Russia about it. But yes, and language-wise and language policy-wise, Central Asia is quite diverse. Each country had their own and has their own language policy. And I would say that particularly for Turkmenistan, and I would also say with respect to Tajikistan as well, based on my communication with other people, is that I think people more and more speak Turkmen, and there is and Tajik in Tajikistan. Everyone whom I've met speaks Tajik. So there was a turn towards these languages. And because we are the most southmost point of it's important to clarify that we were the most southmost point of the USSR, which meant that we were more or less not so much touched by the Soviet modernity. So I think for the most southern parts, we retain the language. So yeah, I don't think that they will succeed very much with these policies, but yeah, and the timing is not also very good. I don't think people want to learn Russian now. I think there is an opposite tendency of people wanting to learn the languages that they were denied previously.
I think this is the main question, right? So how language forms consciousness in Central Asia? And why is Russian still widely used, even though the Soviet Union collapsed over 30 years ago?
Yes, it's important to think how it was imposed. So, for example, my great-grandmother, she's from Kazakhstan, and nobody asked her if she wants to study Russian. It wasn't even a question. And it's important to understand, I'm sure you know, but not everyone understands that these are completely different languages. Kazakh and Turkmen, they have, for example, Turkic origins, and learning Russian overnight, as it was imposed to them, was very, very challenging. And the way it was imposed was with quite colonial dynamics. If you spoke Russian, you were civilized, it was considered in Central Asia back then that you were civilized, in quotation marks, because it's, of course, a very colonial and colonial Latin term, that you were well educated, you had future. If you write in Russian, then you're more likely will have your things published. So yeah, it had a very, very strong influence. And it was one way to create this common image of a man on the idea of Homo Sovieticus, to create this Soviet person based on the idea of a Russian man.
The way you present it sounds very colonial, but yet there are still many Russian scholars and in general also many Western scholars who claim that the Soviet Union was not an empire, right? How do you see it? And what kind of arguments you use in conversations with such people?
Yes, it's a great question. It's a complex question. We need to take into account the years and years of the Soviet propaganda, which was very strong, particularly in the global South. So, if we think about empires and colonialism, one of the key features of empires is that they always grow. And this was something about the USSR. It always grew. It always grew in size. It always expanded. Then it would forcefully dispossess people, and people would be forcefully transferred. And there is a historical data on that. I'm not going to be lying right now because I don't remember. I don't have numbers on me, but I can provide that.
Maybe we can give some examples, okay? Because there are quite a few examples which we can use here.
Yeah, a forceful dispossession of people, forcefully removing them from one place to another, forcefully imposing the language. And particularly, this could be seen, for example, in Canada, they did that as well. That children were separated from their communities, often forcefully separated from their parents, and put in state schools and orphanages so they would learn learn the language and relearn the culture. There would be specific peoples, and I was doing research on that. I was reading memoirs of a Russian, working on memoirs of a Russian woman who came to Turkmenistan to teach in school, and you could see very much from her language that it was a mission to re-educate when the local and everything that was local was seen as backwards, as in need of civilizing, and as in need of re-educating. So erasure of language, there was erasure of language, erasure of culture, imposition of other ways of being. The way people lived, it was seen as something that was barbarian or in need of being tamed. And you can see very much in the memoirs or in ethnographic writing of people who came to Central Asia. They would say, oh, these are stagnant people. These are backwards people. Oh, Central Asia is particularly backwards, and you will hear, and you will also see it in the language and the essentialist language that was used. For example, in I was reading in the Soviet Woman magazine, they would say things like brown, agile fingers. The kind of description, the kind of language they would use quite essentialist to describe locals, or greasy black hair. And it's always the same kind of narrative that there was nothing, there was no education, there was no medicine, there was no progress until the Soviets came and showed and emancipated and liberated. And it's a very strong narrative present in historical accounts, but somehow it escapes Western imagination.
We know about man-made famines, both in Kazakhstan and in Ukraine, which was orchestrated by the Soviet Union. We know about forced collectivization, which basically led to the deaths of thousands and thousands of people. And we know obviously about the gulags as well, right? And also like forceful deportations of thousands of people. How is it still possible that this narrative of a more maybe benevolent Soviet Union is still present, not only in the West, but also very often in Central Asia?
Yeah, there is a lot, and there was man-made famine in Turkmenistan as well, in most of Central Asia as well. I think it has to do with the propaganda and enchantment and the way it's portrayed. It's not portrayed as that was made in the Western, in a lot of Western minds, in the global left's minds. It wasn't portrayed as something that the state purposefully did. It's portrayed as tragic, as a tragedy. Oh, that's something that happened as a natural disaster, despite the fact that there is overwhelming evidence that this was man-made, that it was done very purposefully, that this could have been avoided. And these are not the only examples. And also that all the damage to environment, to the life worlds of people, and people still suffer from that. For example, I've met a woman who was Aigerim Tianova, who was doing a film screening on the effect of the nuclear detonations by the Soviet Union in Kazakhstan, and this disproportionately affected women who still suffer because of that, because some lives were just inexpandable by the Soviet Union. But I guess it's just I think people, I don't know the psychology behind that, but on the one hand, I would say that one thing would be that people love utopia. People are very much driven to this utopian idea and utopian dream, and the Soviet Union represented this for them. And it's very difficult to let go of that dream. I would say that would be one thing. Another thing would be that, and I heard some leftist people say this to me. They would say, "Oh, back then, human life didn't matter that much. It's okay. In the path of liberation, we can sacrifice certain lives," which is a very disturbing way to think. And they would say, "Oh, people had a lot of children. It was okay to lose some of them,"
Yeah.
which is, again, a very disturbing way to think if you think about it. And the third thing, and I wrote an article about that, that would be, but I guess it's more relating to something else, but there is this post-imperial melancholia that a lot of people in Russia would feel because they are attached to the idea. The reason why people in Russia still subscribe to the Soviet myth is because they are still enchanted by the idea of grandiosity, of being this huge empire. They like this idea of greatness, and people particularly recourse to this when things are difficult, when there is economic crisis, when there is demographic crisis. And there is this double narrative that, on the one hand, they are superior, and I'm speaking about Soviet and Russian narratives and discourses. They are superior towards Central Asia, towards indigenous people, towards Caucasus, just because they are Russian. And on the other hand, there is this narrative that they are humiliated. They are humiliated, but you know about that. Madina Tlostanova wrote about it a lot. She calls it Jana's face empire. They were humiliated constantly by the West because the West doesn't want them. I guess these factors combined played its role.
This brings us directly to the direct topic of our conversation today. So this post-colonial nostalgia that is still being felt in Central Asia among some circles, because what we see at the moment is this kind of maybe two processes that run parallelly. One process that is very visible is this decolonial narrative, which seeks to break away from the Soviet Union, from those myths that have been perpetuated by the older generations, and basically liberation of Central Asian communities from this imperial or post-imperial trauma. But at the same time, we also do see that many people in Central Asia, and that includes politicians, that includes public figures, people who are somehow also present in culture, in politics, in public spheres, they still hold tightly to this belief that, Soviet Union was, a benign power, that it was a great place to live, that it transformed Central Asia, in a positive way. So why people still appreciate the Soviet Union so much? Why is it so difficult to accept that there were also the problem, like there were also many, many problems? Is it because that in many Central Asian countries, after independence, the situation was not necessarily better when it comes to human rights and when it comes to, rule of law? How shall we interpret it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think there are a lot of layers to it. One, and you mentioned nostalgia, and I do not work with this term because I prefer melancholia, and I'll explain in a second why. Because it's a psychoanalytic term that can explain certain conditions. But in terms of nostalgia, we need to understand that. I don't know the statistics, but we need to look at the demographics of people who miss Soviet Union. And I'm pretty sure, based on the conversations, based on my lived experiences in the region, I'm not in the region now. I should have probably mentioned that. I live in England for over 8 years now. But I do keep strong contacts with home, and I'd say that it's older generation who feels this way. And I'm not a psychologist, but I guess, and somebody told me this as well, that people get attached to memory, and especially memories of youth. So we need to understand that these people who miss the Soviet Union, they miss their youthful years. They miss the time when they were young. And when you're young, things are different. And I think it's a very natural thing for a human nature to miss those things. And I would say that younger generation, they were left with this search for identity. And in some Central Asian countries, it's more acute than in other. I would say in Turkmenistan, it was a bit easier because people retain traditions. People still wear clothes that are made in Turkmenistan on daily basis. So I was doing some research on resistance to the Soviet modernity, and it said that because we were a tribal nation, and some people also would say that this is a Western construct. But because people traveled a lot and they were nomadic, they needed to strongly get attached to family as a unit socially, but also to the identity. And they kind of retain that. But also there is this very interesting term, and it's common throughout Central Asia. And I don't know if you heard about it, mankurt.
Yes.
And then, this is a legend written in Chingiz Aytmatov's book about what happens to the person who forgets. And forgetting and losing memory is the worst thing, according to that legend, that can happen to you, because you forget your name and you forget your mother's name. And this is probably one of the worst things that could happen to a Central Asian person. It's the worst form of torture, this erasure of memory. And I think this legend is quite emblematic of what the Soviet Union was trying to do. They tried to erase people's names, literally changing them. It's one of the few empires that required people to change their names forcefully, but also in symbolic ways as well. It made people forget. And it's surprising how quickly people can forget and forgive the horrible atrocities, mass scale, large scale violations of human rights and genocide that was happening. And partly it has to do with politics of memory, politics of public memory. Unfortunately, this was not on agenda. And I think it also has to do with the culture, with the desire to build a future, to imagine a different future and to move on rather than to being stuck in the past.
You mentioned that you prefer to use the word melancholy or melancholia rather than nostalgia. Why is that?
It's a great question. Melancholy, and that's why I wrote about it, is an opposite to mourning. Because when somebody loses someone or something, it's normal to feel sad. It's normal to grieve, to mourn. And in this way, the person moves away. It separates from the lost object. While in melancholia, this lost object is not separated from the person's psyche. They cannot let go. They are attached to it. And in their mind, this object, they internalize this object. This object becomes part of their psyche, becomes part of their mind. And they try to create different stories in their psyche. And it's almost like an obsession. And that's the reason why I use this term with respect to Russia, because Russia is obsessed with the idea of empire. And in this article, I write that one of the reasons why there was this reaction to the lack of the complete apathy, the lack of any reaction on behalf of Russia, not any, but majority of Russian society with respect to Russia's illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine, was that Ukraine for them and represented the idea of the Soviet Empire, and they still think about the Soviet Union as if it happened yesterday, despite the fact that it has been so many years. They still think about the borders of the Soviet Union as borders of Russia, and if anyone within these borders tries to behave in their own way, tries to have their own path of development, tries to have their own future, this is seen as an existential threat to Russia. So, and hence this idea of melancholia, this thinking of the object as if of the Soviet Union would be empire, would be the lost object, and thinking of this lost object as if it's not lost, as if it's still there, and obsessively pursuing this object. This is not a new concept. It was developed by Paul Gilroy when he talked about the state of British society after Britain, after a lot of British, not all of them, but after a lot of British former colonies obtained independence.
And do you think that Russia looks at Central Asia with the same type of melancholia it sees Ukraine?
Yes, I think so too. I just think so because it wants to retain its sphere of influence in the region, and it still perceives of its borders as of the borders of the Soviet Union as before. Obviously, it's completely different. The countries are independent, but and sovereign, and everyone has their own path of development. But if any country will behave in a way that will make Kremlin upset, I don't want to be pessimistic or but dystopian, but I would expect a similar reaction.
I once had a conversation with a person working at the Ministry of Education of Uzbekistan about how they teach history. Because I noticed, I basically was teaching at a university in Tashkent for a year. And I noticed that many of my students didn't know much about Uzbekistan's history, especially the moments that could have been seen as controversial, relating to the Soviet influence or, the Soviet decisions. I don't know, the purges of the 30s, for example, or the hujum, things that were not unequivocally positive. And this person told me that because there are so many people with different views about the Soviet Union still living in Uzbekistan, they decided not to touch upon critical issues, not to, create any conflicts. Do you see this in Turkmenistan or any other Central Asian countries? And do you think that it is still related to some sort of, I don't know, intellectual dependency on Russia, which continues even though the Soviet Union is long gone?
I can talk about the way history was taught to me in Turkmenistan. So it was exactly the same thing that you just described. We did not study 20th century. We mostly studied the periods of greatness when we were part of Oghuz Empire, for example. And I guess it had to do with the search of identity. And history was taught to me mostly from Ruhnama, the book that was written by our first president, and he had a special section dedicated to the past. But yes, we completely skipped the 20th century. And I don't know if it's a purposeful move, because most of my teachers, they were still educated in the Soviet Union. And obviously, they could not teach the history of the Soviet Union in any kind of negative sense. So, yeah. And yeah, my mother, for example, she's a historian by education. And she wrote and she researched the 19th century Russia, which is kind of unusual because she gained her she got her education in the Soviet Union, but she was allowed to study that, and she, for example, studied the memoirs of the last Tsar of Russian Empire. She could do that, but she could do that only through a nationalist lens. But it's kind of a side story. But I would say that the reason why the history is being taught this way, it's not because of intellectual dependency on Russia. At least in Turkmenistan, we tried to pave away from that, and we had a different way of learning history with this new attempts of identity building. But I think it's just the habit of the mind, and it had to do with exactly who teaches, because most of our teachers were either Russian or educated by the Soviet Union.
Russian schools are still present in most Central Asian countries. So very often parents decide to send their children to a Russian language school because they assume that this can give the children, a better start or a better career. Is this still happening in Turkmenistan? Or, you mentioned that you had 3 languages, but are those Russian language schools still seen as like more prestigious maybe?
I would say no. I don't think it's the case. In my school, I was sent to the Russian school because most of my classmates were very international. So I had a lot of Armenian classmates, Azerbaijani, Ukrainian, Belarusian, so you name it. We had a very international composition, and I guess it was easier to send them to a Russian school because this was the language that was spoken in the country. But otherwise, I would not say that Russian schools are seen as a sign of prestige. We have a school which used to be quite popular, and it was very difficult to get into it. This was a Russian school run by Russian ministry, but it's only one school, and this would again attract mostly international students. And also, I need to mention that we have quite a strong influence and ties with Turkey, and Turkmen is very, very, in a lot of ways, is quite similar as a language to Turkish. So we had a lot of Turkish lyceums, I don't know how to pronounce it, which were and are still very popular because of the very good education. So I would not say that there is this fascination with the Russian language or Russian schools, but people try to get education, their higher education abroad if they can. But all the universities, absolutely all of the universities in Turkmenistan and higher education institutions are the language of instructions is Turkmen. In some rare cases, it would be English, but otherwise it's Turkmen.
That's actually very interesting to hear because I think it really differs in some other Central Asian countries. But let's go back to the Soviet Union and how it's influenced Central Asia. So how the Soviet Union has influenced life in Central Asia, the way people understand the state, and also how it influenced the state institutions. Do you think that it's still visible, like this Soviet legacy in Central Asia?
There were different areas of how they tried to influence. I studied recently mostly gender as a tool, as a mechanism to penetrate the Sovietness into the region. And there would be special, as you know, from 1920 to 1930, there were this policies called hujum, which is translated from Uzbek as onslaught. And they would try to very quickly and very forcefully re-educate Turkmen women and bring them into the society and bring them into the labor force. And this would be done, even some Soviet ethnographers and historiographers, they say that this was done too fast, which meant that there were casualties even from the Soviet propagandist activists. It was done completely in disregard of local traditions and local needs and local cultures and the needs of the people on the ground. So there were various policies at different periods of time, and it was done through law, through legal machinery, through education, through culture. But in terms of how the state is viewed and state institutions are perceived, I think now there is very little of what is left, and especially in Turkmenistan, maybe on soft power and in terms of cultural interactions. But if you will look at the even infrastructure of this capital city, everything was rebuilt. I'm not saying it's a bad thing or it's a good thing, but the buildings were completely reconstructed, redesigned. Even there was, for example, a famous building with a sculpture of Ernst Niewieczny. And I'm not sure, I've seen it recently in the news, I'm not sure they wanted to either remove it or cover it up, even for things like that, which are considered like high-value artistic works. They are all completely reworked. But I think it's kind of in a way, a bit of a Frankenstein monster. If for example, thinking about Academy of Sciences and education, because these things were constantly redesigned and reconstructed, and a little bit is taken from there, a little bit is taken from a local culture, and then there was an attempt to remove certain things. So I think it's still the process of trial and error, and trying to see what works in the context and what doesn't.
So it seems that Turkmenistan has made the most effort to actually get rid of this Soviet legacy, which is quite interesting because the majority of Central Asian countries are still kind of stuck in this Soviet mentality, the way that the institutions work, the way people think. So maybe Turkmenistan is like a very interesting example here. So when you think about a Soviet man or a post-Soviet man in the context of Central Asia, or maybe in the context of Turkmenistan, what kind of person do you see?
I think there was one image which was imposed on everyone, and that's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And we can see that in decolonial literature as well, that there is a certain idea of a man who was seen as rational, who was seen as pragmatic, who was seen as the man, the image to which, and I'm using man in purpose because it was also gendered and there was complete disregard for other genders. But this idea of a man. For example, in decolonial literature, there is this, and I like her a lot, and I talk about her quite a bit. Sylvia Wynter, she wrote that there is man one and man two. When it came to colonial thinking, man one would be the religious man, and usually this would be a Christian man, and it had to do with metaphysical understanding of how the world is. And then there was man two, who was a rational man, who came with enlightenment, and there was no other sort of other ways of think of what does it mean to be human outside of that. And in the Soviet Union, with the coming of this civilizational communism to educate, re-educate, civilize, quotation marks, backward nations, it was made of this idea of the Soviet man. And this would be a rational man who is actively involved in labor to help the country expand and to extract as many resources as possible, ideally for the good of everyone, but very few reaped the benefits of the Soviet system. Very, very, very few. But and if you would fall outside of this idea, if you couldn't work, if you couldn't labor for whatever reasons, you would not be considered to be the proper person. And this Soviet man, he spoke Russian. And if there was some kind of culture allowed, it was allowed in a very distilled way. So culture without people, culture without. So you could wear your traditional dress, but it would be like a postcard kind of thing, like a souvenir kind of thing. You could practice your own rituals, but to a certain extent. Yes, you can have poetry because poetry is kind of toothless and defanged, but you cannot have literature. You cannot have critical essays in your own language because this does not serve this idea of the Soviet man. It can debunk Soviet propaganda. And the problem was that this image was imposed on everyone in Central Asia. Yes, you can have your little, and it was done in a very essentialist way, in a very exoticizing ways.
And when it comes to the post-Soviet man, let's say, a man of the 90s, but still, with maybe a heart and mind formed by the Soviet Union, is there any kind of person that you see, that you view as this representative of the post-Soviet state or post-Soviet Central Asia?
Yeah, a post-Soviet is a kind of a difficult concept, and I try not to use it. But I like how you clarify that it's a man in the 90s who is this sort of a transitional period man, and how this man looked in Central Asia. I guess it would be very different in every country, in each Central Asian country. But I guess in Turkmenistan, on the one hand, it was independence. and a joy that came with independence. And that's why, for example, Russia had more of identity vacuum, because whereas other countries, they gained independence and they had the statehood. Some of them, not everybody had a chance to have independence and statehood. But those who gained the independence and statehood, they had this moment of celebration, and at the same time, moment of reflection of how do we move ahead? What would our future look like? What is our identity? And there was this, I would say, quite strong search for identity, but also, and more probably everyone says that there was a very materially rooted attempts to exist in the new economy, and economic factor played also a large role. And I would say it's somebody who is optimistic, but also lost and worried about future and material well-being.
From what you're saying, Turkmenistan has somehow managed to break away from this, post-Soviet legacy, or the, Russian imperial legacy. But do you see any ways in which Turkmenistan still depends on Russia, or is there any remnants of this colonial dependence?
Yes, colonial dependencies, they remain because the structures are strong, unless there are, and the process of decolonization is ongoing. In law, the process of decolonization ends once the country obtains statehood. The legal approach to decolonization has many limitations because there are so many questions that are happening. But I guess what's happening is this. On the one hand, the leftover of the Soviet / Russian colonial legacies. On the other hand, there is global modernity, which is penetrating everyone and everything, with the images of the certain pop cultures, certain social media, mass media, all of that, languages, English, etc. So I guess there is. And I like this Central Asian scholar from Kyrgyzstan, Sinat. Okay, will I remember her name now or not? So she wrote a book on nomadity of being, and she wrote that Kyrgyz feminism, it's a patchwork, it's kurak. It got what it could from the Soviet modernity. It also got what gets and what it can from global modernity, from European modernity, from Western European modernity. And it does it sort of in a way which is nearly plagiarism, because it doesn't question, where is it coming from? And it approaches it in more of a practical terms. Okay, these practices, they work for us. Without thinking, where is it coming from? Is it something that we need to question? If it works in a very practical and pragmatic sense, they would adopt it. So it's kind of this patchwork, kurak blanket of everything, of a lot of different things. Many countries have that as well, because it's difficult to say, okay, we were Soviet, and then boom, we were not Soviet. It would be too simplistic to think in this way. But at the same time, I should give credit to the fact that people try to find their own identity, but it's done in this very, a little bit chaotic, but also very purposeful way. And it brings about so many different things. And it has probably to do with our history, because of where Central Asia is located, of how many influences we had historically, and we're used to adapting and adopting.
So do you see any really interesting or interesting movements to watch that seek to break away from dependence on Russia or Russian language in Central Asia today?
Yes, I would say they are not coming from Turkmenistan, but from other countries, particularly in Kazakhstan. And I think Kazakhstan is incredibly interesting. I lived there for 7 years. I am half Kazakh. I hadn't been there for a long time, but I can see that right now. For example, Madina Tlostanova's books are being translated in Kazakh. People want to read that. People want to think about their identity. People also want to challenge these rigid ideas of culture and rigid ideas of gender, for example, that were imposed on us. things like, oh, Central Asians are patriarchal. And this idea that, okay, if it was not for Russians or somebody to come and save us, we will never enter the path of change ourselves, which is not true. We can rethink traditions, we can rethink those social cultural processes as well. So imposing these rigid ideas is also a form of a colonial move that is imposed. So I think people are trying to rethink that, and I see that a lot in Kazakhstan, particularly when it comes to gender. And they try to find something in the past, but they also want to have this right to change, to have this right to rethink their future as well. And I think these movements are very interesting. And what's important is that they are not essentialist. So they don't say, okay, only this is possible. And I'm learning a lot now about settler colonialism. And I find it fascinating that, and I gave an interview about that recently, is that being Central Asian or any kind of other identity, or being somebody who belongs to the land or belongs to the place, it doesn't mean blood relations. So we have a different understanding of kinship and for example, ethnos, or it's about relationality. It's about how we relate to the land. It's about how we relate to one another. And if we think about these terms, decolonization can take a very beautiful term, because it's not about essentialist characteristics that are not subject to change. It's a very relational process.
And what would you advise people to read or to think about to understand the influence Russia still has in the region? Or maybe there is something that you would like to say about that.
Yes, I would say that reading, and we started a Central Asian novel book club, which I think was a very exciting initiative, and we read because of the people who. It won't be modest to say that because I was moderating it, but it was exciting for me, and I really enjoyed that because I finally took time to sit down and sometimes force myself, because everyone's busy, etc., to read Central Asian literature, to read Central Asian novels. And you can see that in these novels in particular, even if it was written back then during the Soviet period, people expose this influence of Russia and expose Soviet coloniality. They talk about identity, a search of belonging, a very special connection to land. And I would say that I would recommend reading more Central Asian authors, not only when it comes to academia, but to literature, because it's the domain where, like in no other place, social relations and historical relations are discussed.
And one last question: you are also my Substack buddy, so you also have a Substack profile. So tell us what we can learn from your Substack.
Yeah, I started it recently. I love collecting things, and I thought that I always lose if I don't put it in one place. So I have my Substack basically serves two purposes. One is to collect all things decolonial. I like reading decolonial literature. It's also meant to educate, because I highlight one key term, one key concept, because there is so much to read. And often the question that I get asked most often is, where do I start? Or where do I start my learning process in decoloniality? So I have a newspaper which is called Nodes from Pluriverse, where I include decolonial news, or news that are relevant to a decolonial struggle. I include one concept, so this way it's not too overwhelming. I recommend new books that are coming out. I also mention initiatives and activist-related resources and tools for activists who would like to organize for decolonial thought. And I also have mentions of opportunities, different workshops that are running around globally, which I encounter. And the second goal of my Substack is to to make the academic writing a bit clearer. So if, for example, I publish an article, I try to write it in a blog format in a very lay language, or I discuss literature, books, also in a very blog lay language style. So yeah, if you're interested, do subscribe. The newspaper comes out on the 21st of each month.
Definitely, I will leave a link to your newsletter in my newsletter. So thank you so much, Selby. That was really interesting, and I hope that my listeners will also find it fascinating as I did. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and it's a fantastic initiative. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you. That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.